Again, if this somehow makes it into the VOD on YouTube, I'm sleep deprived. This reading will be something. It's going to be something at least. It's going to be, a thing on the internet, bare minimum. So, what is communism? So, communism is the doctrine of the conditions of the liberation of the proletariat. What the hell does that mean? If you said that to Aiden Ross, would he be able to plug that in? I don't think so. But I can, okay? And I will try to help you, Aiden. I will try to guide Aiden Ross's hand throughout this whole thing. That's who I'm kind of walking with here. Is like the Aiden Rosses of the world, like the Elons, the Wrights. They're not going to understand. They hate communism. But for everyone else who's like open to socialism, we're going to go a little bit further. But anyway, communism is the doctrine of the conditions of the liberation of the proletariat. Basically, communism is liberating the proletariat. What is the proletariat? Proletariat is that class in society which lives entirely from the sale of its labor and does not draw profit from any kind of capital, whose weal and woe, whose life and death, whose sole existence depend on the demands for labor. Hence, on the changing state of business, the vagaries of unbridled competition, the proletariat or the class of proletarians is, in a word, the working class of the 19th century. And we are still the proletariat because we still have capitalism, right? We are the working class still. Anyone who's ever had a wage job, been an employee, you're a worker. You are part of the proletariat, the working class. If you do not draw any profit from any kind of capital, you are not proletariat, right? Because you don't own capital. You're not drawing profit off of wages, off of rents, off of interests, Anyway, proletarians then have not always existed. No. There have always been poor and working classes, and the working class have mostly been poor, but there have not always been workers and poor people living under conditions as they are today. In other words, there have not always been proletarians any more than there has always been free, unbridled competitions, right? So basically, there's not been proletarians as long as there's been capitalism. The class structure. There's always been poor workers and poor serfs and poor working people. But proletarians are a different sort of step beyond that, right, in capitalism. So, how did the proletariat originate? The proletariat originated in the Industrial Revolution, which took place in England in the last half of the 18th century, and which has since been repeated in all civilized countries of the world. You may be watching a video in that civilized country. Me, I'm living in one, Canada, part of the British Empire, Anyway, the Industrial Revolution was precipitated by the discovery of the steam engine, various spinning machines, the technical loom, and a whole series of other mechanical devices. These machines, which were very expensive and hence could be bought only by big capitalists, altered the whole mode of production and displaced the former workers. Okay, yeah, I was gonna say the farmers, the former workers. And this is why I like reading about. This is why I like reading communist stuff, because it is very critical of our economics, of how we use economics, how capitalism operates, and it's always relevant. I always find something is relevant whenever I read something, and this is 1870 something, right? And it's still relevant to today. You can fucking plug this in with AI and shit. Very expensive machines, like big rich people are the big capitalists are the only basically competitors for those things, right? Anyway, because the machines turned out cheaper and better commodities than the workers could produce with their inefficient spinning wheels and hand looms, The machines delivered industry wholly into the hands of the big capitalists and rendered entirely worthless the merged property of the workers, tools, looms, etc. The result was that the capitalists soon had everything in their hands and nothing remained to the workers. This marked the introduction of the factory system into the textile industry. Once the impulse to the introduction of machinery and the factory system had been given, this system spread quickly to all other branches of industry, especially cloth and book printing, pottery, and the metal industries. Labor was more and more divided among the individual workers, so that the worker who previously had done a complete piece of work now did only a part of that piece. This division of labor made it possible to produce things faster and cheaper. It reduced the activity of the individual worker to simple, endlessly repeated mechanical motions which could be performed not only as well, but much better by a machine. And I worked on a production line. They're just talking about, yeah, you stand there and you do something, right? It's like that boring shit. Like I worked at in a factory. I was of course I'm proletariat, working in a factory, 18, and it was just chips. And all I had to do was take chips, box them, put them on a belt that takes them to the next thing, wherever they need to be going, right? And that's 12 hours a day. Boop, boop, boop. Like, that's it. Besides, like, the cleaning and getting yelled at by your manager. But anyway, let's keep going into the point here. In this way, all these industries fell, one after another, under the dominance of steam machinery and the factory system, just as spinning and weaving had already done. Like, right, innovation in capitalism, phasing out other industries, AI is taking over. AI is a really big one because we're talking about constant capital, which is like AI can literally do any of your jobs if it gets really advanced. And it's like, well, how do you have demand in a market if no one has a job? Stuff like that, right? So it's not great. But at the same time, they also fell into the hands of big capitalists, and their workers were deprived of whatever independence remained to them. So, right. So basically, the market evolved, all these old tools got phased out, and the capitalists left with the big profits, and the workers are now left with whatever they had coming into work that day, right? Leaving with their paycheck, and that's about it. And that is it. Gradually, not only genuine manufacture, but also handicrafts came within the province of the factory system, as big capitalists increasingly displaced the smaller master craftsmen by setting up huge workshops, which saved many expenses and permitted an elaborate division of labor. This is how it has come about I'm just going to water up here. This is how it has come about that in civilized countries at the present time, nearly all kinds of labor are performed in factories, and in nearly all branches of work, handicrafts and manufacture have been superseded. This process has, an ever greater degree, ruined the old middle class. This is very important because this is what is happening right now, today. New technology is phasing out the old middle class. We are always talking about how the middle class today is struggling. Inflation's eating away at the middle class. The middle class is gone. The middle class has never looked worse. This is what capitalism is. This is how it operates. And this was written in 1874. Anyway, I was just thinking of that. I was like, Jesus Christ, could this not be any more accurate to what we're talking about today with AI and the middle class in general just being just so much worse off than ever, right? And the low class, who knows how they're doing that right now? I don't know. Anyway, especially the small handicraftsmen, it has entirely transformed the condition of the workers, and two new classes have been created, which are gradually swallowing up all the others. These are 1. The class of big capitalists who in all civilized countries are already in almost exclusive possession of all the means of subsistence and of the instruments, machines and factories, and materials necessary for the production of the means of subsistence. This is the bourgeois class or the bourgeoisie. 2. The class of the wholly propertyless who are obliged to sell their labor to the bourgeois in order to get, in exchange, the means of subsistence for their support. This is called the class of proletarians or the proletariat. So we have learned what the proletariat is. Congratulations, us, chat. W us. Give us a round of applause if you've made it still here in this stream, in this video that you're watching on YouTube. Hit like, hit subscribe. I should honestly tweet that I'm live, right? Is that a thing that streamers do? That's probably a thing that streamers do, right? I should probably do that. Even if I have 6 followers, okay? I was about to just tweet out the Twitch, a Twitch link in general. I was about to just tweet out the Lord Twitch, have mercy. A Twitch link. Oh God, that was awful. I am so sorry. Chat, I am horrified at what you just had to hear. Anyway, let's just tweet out that I'm live. Hashtag live, hashtag Twitch, hashtag YouTube, hashtag live stream, hashtag communism, baby, hashtag Karl Marx, hashtag sweaty MAGA fascists can cry. Is that a good? That's a good one. That's a good one. That's a banger tweet. I'm gonna like that and retweet it. Anyway, where were we at the Principles of Communism? We're at number 5. How many things are there? Not that I'm tired of reading, but okay, there's 20 something. 25? There's 25. Okay, so we're like 1/7 of the way there. 1/5, right? Is that how that works? 5 times 5 is 25, right? Anyway, we're 1/5 of the way there. Am I being an idiot? This is very interesting. God, my shoulder hurts though. Oh, I need to work today. I'm an unemployed proletariat. Anyway, 5. Under what conditions does this sale of labor of the proletarians to the bourgeoisie take place? Labor is a commodity like any other, and its price is therefore determined by exactly the same laws that apply to other commodities. In a regime of big industry or of free competition, as we shall see, the two come to the same thing. The price of a commodity is, on the average, always equal to its cost of production. Hence, the price of labor is also equal to the cost of production of labor. But the costs of production of labor consist of precisely the quantity of means of subsistence necessary to enable the worker to continue working and to prevent the working class from dying out. The worker will therefore get no more for his labor than is necessary for this purpose. The price of labor, or the wage, will, in other words, be the lowest, the minimum required for the maintenance of life. That is what we have. First of all, is what we have. We have a minimum wage. And in the United States, they didn't even have a minimum wage, right? Before that or something, they had to institute a minimum wage during the Great Depression. So you basically, to break this down, you know what? Let's throw this in the chat GPT, shall we? Because even I'm confused. I would like to break this down for idiots, because I somewhat understood, but I kind of got lost in the technical economics of like the price of the commodity is on average always equal to its cost of production. You know, like, anyway, we're just going to copy and paste this. I'm just going to go quote. Okay. Transcribe this to me like I was Aiden Ross and can't comprehend much. See what this does. The passage is basically saying workers are treated like products. I mean, we were talking about that. Yeah, so if you work at a job, the company pays you kind of like they pay for fuel, minerals, and machine or parts. Your wage isn't mainly based on fairness. It's based on the cheapest amount needed to keep workers alive and able to come back tomorrow. In simpler terms, boss wants to pay as little as possible. Workers need money for food, rent, clothes, etc. So wages usually settle around just enough to survive. And that's all I'm going to read of that. Because that's basically what it's saying. And it's saying you're going to come back to work tomorrow. You leave with nothing. You leave with clothes on your back. You produced all the value at work. And then you leave with the subsistence of life, basically. The maintenance of life. What you need to feed, clothe yourselves. And doesn't it seem like a fair exchange? And you can argue nowadays for sure wages have gone way up. But again, as we said, the middle class is being rotted out, right? Like disaster is kind of baked in to capitalism. It's called depressions and recessions. Part of the business cycle. You learn about it in like grade 10 economics. Built in. Like, how do you avoid a recession? You don't. It happens naturally because that's our economics. It's how it works. However, since business is sometimes better and sometimes worse, it follows that the worker sometimes gets more and sometimes gets less for his commodities. But again, just as the industrialist, on the average of good times and bad, gets no more and no less for his commodities than what they cost. Similarly, on the average, the worker gets no more and no less than his minimum. And that's for every job. You talk about average wages and stuff. They always talk about the basket or the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, of like family of four households, what they kind of need for like a somewhat of a maintenance of life, right? This economic law of wages operates the more strictly, the greater the degree to which big industry has taken possession of all branches of production. What working classes were there before the Industrial Revolution? The working classes have always, according to the different stages of development of society, lived in different circumstances and had different relations to owning and ruling classes. In antiquity, the workers were the slaves of the owners, just as they still are in many backward countries and even in southern parts of the United States. Damn, called out in 18 whatever. In the Middle Ages, they were the serfs of the land-owning nobility, as they still are in Hungary, Poland, and Russia in the Middle Ages, and indeed right up to the Industrial Revolution. There were also journeymen in the cities who worked in the service of the petty bourgeois masters. Gradually, as manufacture developed, these journeymen became manufacturing workers who were even then employed by larger capitalists. 7. In what way do proletarians differ from slaves? This is a great one. We love this one. Which way? We're talking about like wage slavery. So how do they differ? The slave is sold once and for all. The proletarian must sell himself daily and hourly. That is a great difference. That is you kind of nailed it on the head. So instead of being sold, you're selling yourself. So you're still being sold. You're just doing it voluntarily. But market conditions don't really make it voluntarily because you always need to eat and clothe yourself and find shelter. Are we slaves, chat? Are we slaves right now? Are we slaves? Press 1 if you think we're slaves. Anyway, the individual slave, property of one master, is assured an existence, however miserable it may be, because of the master's interest. The individual proletarian, the worker, property, as it were, of the entire bourgeois class, which buys his labor only when someone has need of it, has no secure existence. This existence is assured only to the class as a whole. I love that. The whole I mean, I don't love it. It's a sad reality. The whole working class just has no secure existence whatsoever. Now, of course, in society, there's much more security nets and stuff like that. but still, it's still the same. The slave counts as a thing, not as a member of society. Thus, the slave can have a better existence than the proletarian, while the proletarian belongs to a higher stage of social development and himself stands on a higher social level than the slave. The slave frees himself when, of all the relations of private property, he abolishes only the relation of slavery, and thereby becomes a proletarian. The proletarian can free himself only by abolishing private property in general. Now, this is a good distinction. This is a great distinction, because the slave frees himself when he abolishes the relations of private property. You cannot sell human beings. Human beings cannot be private property, right? He abolishes the relations of slavery. You cannot have slavery, right? You had a war over slavery. There are no more slaves, right? It's not that, and this is a big debate between like socialists and communists, because reformists, who are always like advocating for better healthcare, higher wages, etc., that's great. But what we're talking about is abolishing private property in general when you're talking about communism, because you can talk about slavery and say, yes, you can feed the slave better, you can clothe him better, you can treat him nicer, you can put him in better conditions. That's all great, but the problem is still the relation of slavery. He's still a piece of property. That relationship has to be abolished. Same thing with the proletarian. He can only free himself if that wage relationship is abolished, private property is abolished. So, in what way do proletarians differ from serfs? The serf possesses and uses an instrument of production, a piece of land, in exchange for what he gives up, a part of his product or part of his services of his labor. The proletarian works with the instruments of production of another for the account of this other in exchange for a part of the product. The serf gives up, the proletarian receives. The serf has an assured existence, the proletarian does not. The serf is outside competition. The proletarian is in it. And that's an important distinction, because in capitalism, in the free market, you aren't secure if you don't have a job, right? You are like literally unsecure. You're secured by the minimums of society, really, or family members, like, you know. Anyway, the serf liberates himself in one of three ways. Either he runs away to the city and there becomes a handicraftsman, or instead of products and services, he gives money to his lord and thereby becomes a free tenant, or he overthrows his feudal lord and he himself becomes a property owner. In short, by one route or another, he gets into the owning class and enters into competition. The proletarian liberates himself by abolishing competition, private property, and all class differences. In what way do proletarians differ from handicraftsmen? In contrast to the proletarian, the so-called handicraftsman, as he still existed almost everywhere in the past 18th century and still exists here and there at the present, is a proletarian at most temporarily. His goal is to acquire capital himself, wherewith to exploit other workers. He can often achieve this goal where guilds still exist, or where freedom from guild restrictions has not yet led to the introduction of factory-style methods into the crafts not yet to fierce competition. But as soon the factory system has been introduced into the crafts and competition flourishes fully, this perspective dwindles away and the handicraftsman becomes more and more a proletarian. The handicraftsman therefore frees himself by becoming either bourgeois or entering the Middle Ages in general, or the Middle Ages, entering the middle class in general, or becoming a proletarian because of competition, as is now more often the case. In which case he can free himself by joining the proletarian movement, i.e., more or less communist movement. 10. In what way do proletarians differ from manufacturing workers? The manufacturing worker of the 16th to the 18th centuries still had, but few exception, an instrument of production in his own possession, his loom, the family spinning wheel, and little plot of land which he cultivated in his spare time. The proletarian has none of these things. The manufacturing worker almost always lives in the countryside and in a more or less patriarchal relation to his landlord or employer. The proletarian lives, for the most part, in the city, and his relation to his employer is purely a cash relation. The manufacturing worker is torn out of his patriarchal relation by big industry, loses whatever property he still has, and in this way becomes a proletarian. 11. This is a lengthy one, an important one. What were the immediate consequences of the Industrial Revolution and of the division of society into the bourgeois and the proletariat? First, the lower and lower prices of industrial products brought about the machine labor totally destroyed in all countries of the world the old system of manufacture or industry based upon hand labor. In this way, all semi-barbarian countries, which had hitherto been more or less strangers to historical development and whose industry had been based on manufacture, were violently forced out of their isolation. They bought the cheaper commodities of the English and allowed their own manufacturing workers to be ruined. Countries which had known no progress for thousands of years, example India, were thoroughly revolutionized, and even China is now on the way to a revolution. We have come to point out where a new machine invented in England deprives millions of Chinese workers of their livelihoods within a year's time. In this way, big industry has brought all people of the earth into contact with each other, has merged all local markets into one world market, has spread civilization and progress everywhere, and has thus ensured that whatever happens in civilized countries will have repercussions in all other countries. It follows that if the workers in England or France now liberate themselves, it must set off revolution in all other countries. Revolutions which sooner or later must accomplish the liberation of their respective working class. Second, whatever big industries displaced manufacture, the bourgeois developed in wealth and power. See, this is kind of cool, because this was written in 18 and Engels is talking about whatever big industries displaced manufacture. And we're talking about Trump and China and stuff, talking about like bringing back manufacturing because AI is replacing manufacturing. So this is interesting. So whatever big industries displaced manufacture, the bourgeois developed in wealth and power to the utmost and made itself the first class of the country. The result was that wherever this happened, the bourgeois took political power into its own hands and displaced the hitherto ruling classes, the aristocracy, the guild masters, and the representative, the absolute monarchy. The bourgeois alienated the power of the aristocracy, the nobility, by abolishing the entailment of estates. In other words, by making landed property subject to purchase and sale, and by doing away with the special privileges of the nobility, it destroyed the power of the guild masters by abolishing guilds and handicraft privileges. In their place, it put competition. That is a state of society in which everyone has the right to enter into any branch of industry, the only obstacle being a lack of the necessary capital. The introduction of free competition is thus public declaration that from now on the members of society are unequal only to the extent that their capitals are unequal. That capital is the decisive power, and that therefore the capitalists, the bourgeois, have become the first class in society. And you see this today, the rich, the billionaires, the elites, the Elons, they are the first class. The introduction of free competition is we just read that. Free competition is necessary for the establishment of big industry because it is the only condition of society in which big industry can make its way. Having destroyed the social power of the nobility and the guild masters, the bourgeois also destroyed their political power. Having raised itself to the actual position of the first class in society, it proclaims itself to be also the dominant political class. This it does through the introduction of the representative system, which rests on bourgeois equality before the law and the recognition of free competition, and in European countries takes the form of constitutional monarchy. In these constitutional monarchies, only those who possess a certain capital are voters. That is to say, only members of the bourgeois. These bourgeois voters choose the deputies, and these bourgeois deputies, by using their right to refuse to vote taxes, choose a bourgeois government. Third, everywhere the proletariat develops in step. Anyway, sorry, I'm having like a fucking malfunction here. Again, sleep deprived. Third, everywhere the proletariat develops in step with the bourgeois, in proportion as the bourgeois grows in wealth, the proletariat grows in numbers. For since the proletarians can be employed only by capital, and since capital extends only through employing labor, it follows that the growth of the proletariat proceeds at precisely the same pace as the growth of capital. And this makes sense. They need each other because there is no capital without workers. There's no working class without the relation to capital. Simultaneously, this process draws members of the bourgeois and proletarians together into the great cities where industry can be carried on most profitably, and by thus throwing great masses in one spot, it gives to the proletarians a consciousness of their own strength. Moreover, the further this process advances, the more new labor-saving machines are invented, the greater is the pressure exercised by big industry on wages, which, as we have seen, sink to their minimum, as therewith render the condition of the proletariat increasingly unbearable. The growing dissatisfaction of the proletariat thus joins with its rising power to prepare a proletarian social revolution. And everyone talks about civil war and revolution and stuff like that. Oh, it's never going to happen. It's going to happen eventually. I'm not sure if it talks about it in this introduction to communism, but talk about AI. As soon as you have AI that can do everyone's job and take away all that demand, are people going to be okay with the government declaring their wages? I don't know how that would work. I don't know. Because you're going to have a mass of unemployed proletariat, impoverished, pissed off, right? Like you saw the Capitol got overthrown over COVID or whatever the fuck. I don't know. Fake vote, right? Just wait until everything gets worse. Anyway. What were the further consequences of the Industrial Revolution? big industry created in this Big industry created in the steam engine and other machines the means of endlessly expanding industrial production, speeding it up and cutting its costs. With production thus facilitated, the free competition, which is necessarily bound up with big industry, assumed the most extreme forms. A multitude of capitalists invaded industry, and in a short while, more was produced than was needed. As a consequence, finished commodities could not be sold, and a so-called commercial crisis broke out. Factories had to be closed, their owners went bankrupt, and the workers were without bread. Deepest misery reigned everywhere. After a time, the superfluous products were sold. The factories began to operate again, wages rose, and gradually businesses got better than ever. But it was not long before too many commodities were again produced, and a new crisis broke out, only to follow the same course as its predecessor. So when we talk about the business cycle, the booms and busts, in a lot of these markets, you are talking about overproduction, because you can only produce as long as it's so profitable, and once it's gone, it's cooked, it's over. You know, but but then it crashes, and then the rich people save all their money, they survive all the crash, you lose your job and struggle, and capitalists buy up all the nice stuff that they want during the repression because they have enough money to buy low during a repression. You don't. Recession, and then they profit more, so it's kind of great. Anyway, but it was not long before too many. So the business cycle, right? Ever since the beginning of this 19th century, the condition of industry has constantly fluctuated between periods of prosperity and periods of crisis, nearly every 5 to 7 years. And this is still true, by the way. This is still true. This is like economics. There's a recession every 5 to 7 years. It's just part of what we do here. Part of the great economics that we use. A fresh crisis has intervened, always with the greatest hardship for the workers, and always accompanied by general revolutionary stirrings and the direct peril of the whole existing order of things, right? Because we're like, what the fuck? What the fuck is going on here? I think I'm going to get to 15, and then we're going to take another break. My throat is hurting, man. Couldn't be the smoking. Has to be, I don't know, natural. Anyway, what follows from these periodic commercial crises? First, that though big industry in its earliest stage created free competition, it has now outgrown free competition. That for big industry, competition and generally the individualistic organization of production have become a fetter which it must and will shatter. That so long as big industry remains on its present footing, it can be maintained only at the cost of general chaos every 7 years, each time threatening the whole civilization and not only plunging the proletarians into misery, but also running large sections of the bourgeoisie. Hence, either that big industry must itself be given up, which is an absolute impossibility, or that it makes unavoidably necessary an entirely new organization of society in which production is no longer directed by mutually competing individual industrialists, but rather by the whole society operating according to a definite plan and taking account of the needs of all. Right? It's like how many more cycles of crisis can the workers take before we all just go, this is enough? We need to create an economy that benefits everybody, not just rich capitalists. But anyway, second, that big industry and the limitlessness expansion of production which it makes possible, brings within the range of feasibility a social order in which so much is produced that every member of society will be in a position to exercise and develop all his powers and facilities in complete freedom and faculties in complete freedom. It thus appears that the very qualities of big industry, which our present day society produce misery, and crisis, are those which, in a different form of society, will abolish this misery and these catastrophic depressions. We will see the greatest clarity, one, that all these evils are from now on to be ascribed solely to a social order which no longer corresponds to the requirements of the real situation, and two, that it is possible through a new social order to do away with these evils altogether. 14. What will this new social order have to be like? Above all, it will have to take control of industry and of all branches of production out of the hands of mutually competing individuals, and instead institute a system in which all these branches of production are operated by society as a whole. That is, for the common account, according to a common plan, and with the participation of all members of society. And this is why I don't get why people say communism is bad and evil. Because when you hear this, you go, that's not very evil. It just kind of makes sense. Like, everyone should be more involved in how like society is shaped, you know? So whatever. It will, in other words, abolish competition and replace it with association. Moreover, since the management of industry by individuals necessarily implies private property, and since competition is in reality merely the manner and form in which the control of industry by private property owners expresses itself, it follows that private property cannot be separated from competition and the individual management of industry. Private property must therefore be abolished, and in its place must come the common utilization of all instruments of production and the distributions of all products according to common agreement. In a word, what is called communal ownership of goods, right? And this is another thing that doesn't make sense about capitalism, is because if certain items are too expensive to buy, let's say food, you're gonna have a lot of people who starve just simply because they can't afford the price of food, you know, and shit like that, or can't get breast milk or baby milk, whatever it is. You know, I don't know. And, you know, people with the most money shouldn't really get the best healthcare. You know, healthcare should be a communal good for everyone. Anyway, in fact, the abolition of private property is doubtless the shortest and most significant way to characterize the revolution in a whole social order which has been made necessary by the development of industry, and for this reason, it is rightly advanced by communists as their main demand. Yeah. And I could honestly see this with AI. I could. A abolition of private property. You talking about private property like the means of production, not like your toothbrush. 15, everybody. 15. Are you still here? 15. Press 1 if you're 15. Press 2 if you're still here. Subscribe on YouTube if you are still watching. It's been a rough one, but thank you. No one is here, but that is okay. 15. Was not the abolition of private property possible at an earlier time? No. Every change in the social order, every revolution in property relations is the necessary consequence of the creation of new forces of production, which no longer fit into the old property relations. Private property has not always existed. When, towards the Middle Ages, there arose a new mode of production which could not be carried on under the then existing feudal and guild forms of property. This manufacture, which had outgrown the old property relations, created a new property form, private property. And for manufacture, at the earliest stage of development of big industry, private property was the only possible property form. The social order based on it was the only possible social order. So long as it is not possible to produce so much that there is enough for all, with more left over for expanding the social capital and extending the forces of production. So long as this is not possible, there must always be a ruling class directing the use of society's productive forces and a poor oppressed class. How these classes are constituted depends on the stage of development. The agrarian Middle Ages gives us the baron and the serf. The cities of the later Middle Ages show us the guildmaster and the journeyman and the day laborer. The 17th century has its manufacturing workers, and the 19th has big factory owners and proletarians. It is clear that up to now, the forces of production have never been deployed to the point where enough could be developed for all, and that private property has become a fetter. What the hell? Am I saying that weird? A fetter and a barrier in relation to the further development of the forces of production. Now, however, the development of big industry has ushered in a new period. Capital and the forces of production have been expanded to an unprecedented extent, and the means are at hand to multiply them without limit in the near future. Moreover, the forces of production have been concentrated in the hands of a few bourgeois, while the great masses of people are more and more falling into the proletariat, their situation becoming more wretched and intolerable in proportion to the increase of wealth of the bourgeoisie. And finally, these mighty and easily extended forces of production have so far outgrown private property and the bourgeoisie that they threaten at any moment to unleash the most violent disturbances of the social order. That's not great. That's the times we're living in, I think. The most violent disturbances of the social order. I'm not ready for that. I'm not ready, Frederick. I'm not. Quite frankly, honestly, just bring it on at this point. How much worse could it get? Now, under these conditions, the abolition of private property has become not only possible, but absolutely necessary. So yeah, we're not there yet, but we easily could be on our way. Somehow. Unless all these theories are bullshit, which many people want to say they are. But the more you read, the more you kind of think, well, at a point, you talk about like the concentration of wealth, and you're like, yeah, get that. But anyway, this is cool. Will the peaceful abolition of private property be possible? This is interesting because lots of people like Hassan and other socialists like Bernie always kind of condemn like violent protesters, like violence. It's like socialism is okay until you talk about like a violent revolution because everyone is actually poor and starving. Like, well, I don't know. Will it be peaceful? It would be desirable if this could happen, but the communists would certainly be the last to oppose it. Communists know only too well that all conspiracies are not only useless, but even harmful. They know too well that revolutions are not made intentionally and arbitrarily, but that everywhere and always they have been the necessary consequences of conditions which were wholly independent of the will and direction of individual parties and entire classes. But they also see that the development of the proletariat in nearly all civilized countries has been violently suppressed, and that in this way, the opponents of communism have been working towards a revolution with all their strength. If the oppressed proletariat is finally driven to revolution, then we communists will defend the interests of the proletarians with deeds as we now defend them with words. Yeah. And this is kind of my thinking about a revolution. If a revolution were to happen, nobody, at least in North America, in the West, I don't like America. Anyone educated enough? Like, I don't know how a communist revolution happens because no one kind of understands it. I think everyone just kind of understands we're pissed at the people in charge of this shit. But anyway, Will it be possible for private property to be abolished at one stroke? No. No more than existing forces of production can at one stroke be manipulated to the extent necessary for the creation of a communal society. In all probability, the proletarian revolution will transform existing society gradually and will be able to abolish private property only when the means of production are available in sufficient quantity. Talking of could be AI. Maybe is AI, if not, what's next after AI that's going to abolish private property? Like robots, AI robots that are literally humans, like boop boop bop, like that shit. Anyway, what will be the course of this revolution? Oh, this is a big one. What will be the course of this revolution? Above all, it will establish a democratic constitution, and through this, the direct and indirect dominance of the proletariat. Direct in England, where the proletarians are already a majority of the people. Indirect in France and Germany, where the majority of the people consists not only of proletarians, but also small peasants and petty bourgeois, who are in the process of falling into the proletariat, who are more and more dependent in all their political interests on the proletariat, and who must therefore soon adapt the demands of the proletariat. Perhaps this will cost a second struggle, but the outcome can only be the victory of the proletariat. Yeah, so it's like, what are your goals of the revolution? And that's the thing, when you talk about victory of the proletariat, a proletariat, like top class, whatever you want to call it, what does that look like? Like, what does that mean? What does that look like, in practice? And again, it's communal. Everyone's kind of working together. And I think it's crazy we're not kind of all doing that already, working together, having input on kind of everything in a democratic manner with internet. Like, we can talk across the globe. Like, what? Like, no one. Anyway, democracy would be wholly valueless if the proletariat. Yeah, democracy would be wholly valueless to the proletariat if it were not immediately used as a means for putting through measures directed against private property and ensuring the livelihood of the proletarians. The main measures emerging as a necessary result of the existing relations are the following: limitation of private property through progressive taxation, heavy inheritance taxes, abolition of inheritance through collateral lines, nephews, brothers, etc., forced loans, etc. 2. Gradual expropriation of landowners, industrialists, railroad magnates, and ship owners, partly through competition by state industry, partly direct through compensation in the form of bonds. 3. Confiscation of the possessions of all immigrants with an E. Immigrants? Am I being stupid? Wait. Am I being... Come on now. Can I? We live in an age where immigrant... I can't. Immigrant is like the new word. What does this mean? Confiscation of the possessions of all immigrant and rebels against the majority of people. So just rebels and immigrants against the majority of people. Sure. Yeah, I get it. Okay, I get it. They're talking about immigrants. Yeah, no shit. Organization of labor or employment of proletarians on publicly owned land in factories and workshops, with competition among the workers being abolished and with the factory owners, insofar as they still exist, being obliged to pay the same high wages as those paid by the state. An equal obligation on all members of society to work until such time as private property has been completely abolished. Formation of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. And you can kind of talk about this. Kind of reminds me of China, because it's like it's a gradual process building a society like this. Because society, like in China, private property has not been abolished. There are still capitalists in China. There are still private billionaires in China. They still have a big capitalists. They're capitalists. They are a communist state, but their economics is still capitalist largely. Anyway, but they do hold up, I think, a lot of these principles. I don't know, China. Dude, it's either my beard is fucking with my nose or the coke I snorted earlier. I don't really know. Anyway, God. I'm just kidding. I don't actually do coke. It's just a weed. I fucking have a stupid Kirby bong. Anyway. This is legal. We're in Canada, by the way, if anyone sees this and is like, blah, blah, blah. Which is not going to happen. Who the fuck cares? People smoke on weed on stream 8. What are we doing here? Sorry. An equal obligation on all members of society to work until such time as private property has been completely abolished. Formation of industry armies, especially for agriculture. Centralization of money and credit in the hands of the state through a national bank with state capital, and the suppression of all private banks and bankers. Increase the number of national factories, workshops, railroads, ships, bringing new lands into cultivation, and improvement of land already under cultivation, all in proportion to the growth of the capital and labor force at the disposal of the nation. Education of all children from the moment they can have their mother's care in national establishments at national costs, education and production together. Construction on public lands of great places construction on public lands of great places as communal dwellings for associated groups of citizens engaged in both industry and agriculture and combining in their way of life the advantages of urban and rural conditions while avoiding the one-sidedness and drawbacks of each. Destruction of all unhealthy and jerry-built dwellings in urban districts, equal inheritance rights for children born in and out of wedlock, concentration of all means of transportation in the hands of the nation. It is impossible, of course, to carry out all of these measures at once, but one will always bring others in its wake. Once the first radical attack on private property has been launched, the proletariat will find itself forced to go ever further to concentrate increasingly in the hands of the state, all capital, all agriculture, all transport, all trade. All the foregoing measures are directed to this end, and they will become practicable and feasible capital of producing their centralized effects to precisely the degree that the proletariat, through its labor, multiplies its country's productive forces. So basically, it's saying the proletariat will make the decisions with all of society's production value because they've produced it. You work together for a common goal to benefit society, right? You all worked hard at work anyway. We all go to work and work 12-hour shifts, 8-hour shifts to produce the commodities and the subsistence for life at work. We should kind of have a say in what happens with that value that shape society with. It's kind of like important, I think. Anyway, 19. Will it be possible for this revolution to take place in one country alone? No. By creating the world market, big industry has already brought all the peoples of Earth, and especially the civilized peoples, into such close relation with one another that none is independent of what happens to the others. Further, it has coordinated the social development of the civilized countries such to an extent that in all of them, bourgeoisie and proletariat have become the decisive classes, and the struggle between them the greater the struggle of the day. It follows that the communist revolution will not merely be a national phenomenon, but take place simultaneously in all civilized countries. That is to say, at least in England, America, France, and Germany, it will develop in each of those countries more or less rapidly, according to one country or the other has more developed industry, greater wealth, more significant mass of productive forces. Hence, Lord have mercy. Hence, it will go slowest and will meet the most obstacles. In Germany, hence it will go slowest and will meet most obstacles in Germany most rapidly and with the fewest in England. And probably the fewest in America now. But still, struggles. It will have a powerful impact on the other countries of the world and will radically alter the course of development which they have followed up to now, while greatly stepping up its pace. It is a universal revolution and will accordingly have a universal range. And that makes sense. You saw that with globalization, right? Like we've just read about for the past hour. Okay, this is really the last biggest paragraph, and then it's kind of it. So, what will be the consequences of the ultimate disappearance of private property? Society will take all forces of production and means of commerce, as well as the exchange and distribution of products, out of the hands of private capitalists and will manage them in accordance with a plan based on the availability of resources and the needs of the needs of the whole society. In this way, most important of all, the evil consequences which are now associated under the conduct of big industry will be abolished. There will be no more crises. There will be no more crises. The expanded production, which for the present order of society is overproduction and hence a prevailing cause of misery, will then be insufficient and in need of being expanded much further. Instead of generating misery, overproduction will reach beyond the elementary requirements of society to assure the satisfaction of the needs of all. It will create new needs and, at the same time, the means of satisfying them. It will become the condition of and the stimulus to new progress, which will no longer throw the whole social order into confusion, as progress has always done in the past. Big industry, freed from the pressure of private property, will undergo such an expansion that what we now see will seem as petty in comparison as manufacture seems when put beside the big industry of our own day. This development of industry will make available to society a sufficient mass of products to satisfy the needs of everyone. Can I react to Russian music for my YouTube channel? Is it your music? I'm reading the Principles of Communism here. I'm not about to go listen to Russian music right now. I'm sorry. But I got at least 15 more minutes of reading. I'm trying to become a hardcore, you know. But maybe after. It's a good idea. I've listened to German music and that shit bangs, man. That shit goes fucking hard. I don't know if you're Russian. I'm not to say I don't know if there's beef there, but I'm just saying the music, hey, some of the music went hard. Anyway, what the fuck was I? Yeah, satisfy the needs of everyone. Got it? That's what communism is. Satisfying the needs of everyone. Communism. Am I right? Anyway, the same will be true of agriculture, which also suffers from the pressure of private property and is held back by the division of privately owned land into small parcels. Here, existing improvements and scientific procedures will be put into practice with a resulting leap forward, which will assure to society all the products it needs. In this way, such an abundance of goods will be able to satisfy the needs of all its members. The division of society into different mutually hostile classes will then become unnecessary. I think it's already pretty unnecessary today. Indeed, it will be not only unnecessary, but intolerable in the new social order. The existence of classes originated in the division of labor, and the division of labor, as it has been known up to the present, will completely disappear. For mechanical and chemical processes are not enough to bring industrial and agricultural production up to the level we have described. The capitalists of the men who make use of these processes must undergo a corresponding development. That's a mouthful. That's, Anyway. Just as the peasants and manufacturing workers of the last century changed their whole way of life and became quite different people when they were drawn into big industry, in the same way, communal control over production by society as a whole and the resulting new development will both require an entirely different kind of human material. People will no longer be, as they are today, subordinated to a single branch of production, bound to it, exploited by it. They will no longer develop one of their faculties at the expense of all others. They will no longer know only one branch of a single branch of production as a whole, even industry as it is today, in finding such people less and less useful. Talk about that today, dude. We're talking about this is in the 1800s. He's like, yeah, this whole, fucking production shit, I'm kind of over it. 120 years later, it's like the exact same. Almost. Same core, same bare bones. But anyway, industry controlled by society as a whole and operated according to a plan presupposes well-rounded human beings, their faculties developed in balanced fashion, able to see the system of production in its entirety. The form of the division of labor, which makes one peasant, another a cobbler, a third a factory worker, a fourth a stock market operator, has always been undermined by machinery and will completely disappear. Education will enable young people quickly to familiarize themselves with the whole system of production and to pass from one branch of production to another in response to the needs of society or their own inclinations. It will therefore free them from the one-sided character which the present-day division of labor impresses upon every individual. Communist society will, in this way, make it possible for its members to put their comprehensively developed faculties to full use. But when this happens, classes will necessarily disappear. It follows that society organized on a communist basis is incompatible with the existence of classes on the one hand, and the very building of such a society provides the means of abolishing class differences of another. It's like at some point it will make so much nonsense. It will, like, being an employee already doesn't make a lot of sense when you kind of look at it. Like, you can look at the wealth gap and say that doesn't make sense. You do hard labor for like 8 hours a day and you get paid the shittiest wage. You get paid the shits, and then some douchebag at the top goes and has fun and gets to decide what to do with all of the value everyone created together. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Kind of sucks if you don't own it. If you own the capital, then you're like, oh, fuck you. Work harder, idiot. A corollary of this is that the difference between city and country is destined to disappear. The management of agriculture and industry by the same people rather than by two different classes of people is, if only for purely material reasons, a necessary condition of communist association. The dispersal of the agriculture population on the land alongside the crowding of the industrial population into the great cities is a condition which corresponds to an undeveloped state of both agriculture and industry and can already be felt as an obstacle to further development. The general cooperation of all members of society for the purpose of planned exploitation of the forces of production, the expansion of production to the point where it will satisfy the need of all, the abolition of a situation in which the needs of some are satisfied at the expense of the needs of others, the complete liquidation of classes and their conflicts, the rounded development of the capacities of all members of society through the elimination of the present division of labor, through industrial education, through engaging in various activities, through the participation by all in enjoyments produced by all through the combinations of city and country. These are the main consequences of the abolition of private property. kind of goated, to be honest. Kind of cool. Um, but yeah. Anyway, we're gonna just ram out 21, 22, 25, and stuff. 21. What will be the influence of communist society on the family? It will transform the relations between the sexes into a purely private matter which concerns only the persons involved and into which society has no association to intervene. It can do this since it does not. It can do this since it does away with private property and educates children on a communal basis, and in this way removes the two bases of traditional marriage, the dependence rooted in private property of the woman on the man and of the children on the parents. And here's the answer to the outcry of the highly moral Philistines against the community of women. Community of women is a condition which belongs entirely to bourgeois society and which today finds its complete expression in prostitution. But prostitution is based on private property and falls with it. Thus, communist society, instead of introducing community of women, it abolishes it. So instead of introducing a community of women, it abolishes a community of women because we're all a community, right? Anyway, what will be the attitude of communism to existing nationalities? The nationalities of peoples associating themselves in accordance with the principle of community will be compelled to mingle with each other as a result of this association and thereby to dissolve themselves, just as the various estate and class distinctions must disappear through the abolition of their basis private property. What will be its attitude to existing religions? All religions so far have been the expression of historical stages of development of individual peoples or groups of peoples, but communism is the stage of historical development which makes all existing religions superfluous and brings about their disappearance. How do communists disappear from socialists? Or how do communists differ from socialists? Here we go. So this is important. This is kind of like an important part of communism. How do communists differ from socialists? Because this is like, how does Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Vladimir Lenin compare to socialists of today, like Hassan Abi, Bernie Sanders, AOC, and the like, right? Like those people. We're going to be talking about a lot of these different socialists, and I'm excited because I don't really know a lot of the whole breakdown. So, how do communists differ from socialists? The so-called socialists are divided into three categories. The first category consists of adherents of a feudal and patriarchal society which has already been destroyed, reactionary socialists, and is still daily being destroyed by big industry and world trade at their creation, bourgeois society. This category concludes from the evils of existing society that feudal and patriarchal society must be restored because it was free of such evils. In one way or another, all their proposals are directed to this end. This category of reactionary socialists, for all their seeming partisanship and their scalding tears for the misery of the proletariat, it nevertheless energetically opposed by the communists for the following reasons. 1, it strives for something which is entirely impossible. 2, it seeks to establish the rule of the aristocracy, the guild masters, the small producers, their routine of absolute or feudal monarchs, soldiers, priests, a society which was, to be sure, free of the evils of present-day society, but which brought it at least as many evils without even offering to the oppressed workers the prospect of liberation through a communist revolution. 3, as soon as the proletariat become revolutionary and communist, these reactionary socialists show their true colors by immediately making common cause with the bourgeois against the proletarians. Bourgeois socialists. The second category consists of adherents of present day society who have been frightened for its future by the evils to which it necessarily gives rise. What they want, therefore, is to maintain the society while getting rid of the evils which are an inherent part of it. So we're talking about the Hassan Abis of the world, the bourgeois socialists, the rich socialists, right? You know, they have been frightened for its future of the evils which capitalism gives rise to. This end, some purpose mere welfare measures, while others come forward with grandiose systems of reform, which, under the pretense of reorganizing society, are in fact intended to preserve the foundations and hence the life of existing society. Communists must unremittingly struggle against these bourgeois socialists because they work for the enemies of the communists and protect the society which communists aim to overthrow. So when Hassan says that he's a Marxist and he's a socialist and all of that, he's not actually a socialist. He's a fake socialist. He's a bourgeois socialist. He's a reformist. He's not a communist. Let me tell you that. But he calls himself a Marxist, and all of his followers say that they're Marxists. But Marx and Engels, who wrote this piece, would go, "Fuck you! You are still operating in a way that maintains the structure that socialists, communists want to overthrow. So you're not really a socialist. You're a democratic socialist, bourgeois socialist, reformist. You're not a communist. That's all. You're not a Marxist. That's for sure." Anyway. Third, democratic socialists. We were just talking about them. Finally, the third category consists of democratic socialists who favor some of the same measures the communists advocate, as described in question 18, not as part of the transition to communism, however, but as measures which they believe will be sufficient to abolish the misery and evils of present-day society. These democratic socialists are either proletarians who are not yet sufficiently clear about the conditions of the liberation of their class, or they are representatives of the petty bourgeois, a class which, prior to the achievement of democracy and the social measures to which it gave rise, has many interests in common with the proletariat. It follows that in moments of action, the communists will have to come to an understanding with these democratic socialists and in general to follow as far as possible a common policy with them, provided that these socialists do not enter into the service of the ruling bourgeois and attack the communists. Now, this is also very, very important for the socialists of today, the Mamdanis, the AOCs, the Bernie Sanders. They are not socialists. They attack communists. They do not like communists. They are not about abolishing private property. They're not about socialism. They're about democratic socialism. They want to just relieve society of some ails with higher taxation, for more progressive taxation, stuff like that. It is clear that this form of cooperation in action does not exclude the discussions of differences. 25. What is the attitude of the communists to the other political parties of our time? This is interesting. This is the last one, so I'm going to clear my throat. And automatically ruin it again by hitting a vape. But this was very interesting as a read. I'm glad I read today. I'm glad I read, chat. I feel like my brain grew a little bit. I feel like my brain got stronger. I feel like I learned something. Feels like I had a what's it called? An upgrade, like an experience gain reading this in my communist journey to become a communist. The perfect communist. The perfect communist. That's hilarious. But anyway. Anyway, what is the attitude of the communists to the other political parties of our time? This attitude is different in different countries. England, France, and Belgium, where the bourgeois rule, the communists still have a common interest with the various democratic parties, an interest which is all the greater the more closely the socialistic measures they champion approach the aims of the communists. That is, the more clearly and definitely they represent the interests of the proletariat, and the more they depend on the proletariat for support. In England, for example, the working class Chartists are indefinitely closer to the communists than the democratic petty bourgeois or the so-called radicals. In America, where a democratic constitution has already been established, the communists must make the common cause with the party which will turn this constitution against the bourgeois and use it in the interest of the proletariat against, that is, with the agrarian national reformers. It's funny that they talk about America and using the constitution to basically crush the bourgeois, because in America currently, Donald Trump is using the constitution to basically suppress and destroy even more parts of the working class. So that's, interesting, an interesting revelation there. 100 years plus ago. Anyway, in Switzerland, the radicals, though a very mixed party, are the only group in which the communists can cooperate. And among these radicals, the Vaudois and Genovese are the most advanced. In Germany, the decisive struggle now on the order of the day is that between the bourgeois and the absolute monarchy. Since the communists cannot enter upon the decisive struggle between themselves and the bourgeois until the bourgeois is in power, it follows that it is in the interest of the communists to help the bourgeois to power as soon as possible in order the sooner to be able to overthrow it. This is something that Lenin talks about too, basically trying to skip over capitalism. Basically, like, if you're not in a historical materialistic sense, it's a cycle that of building. Like a revolution isn't something that just happens. It's built, it's natural. Classes are crushing and forming out of one another, right? So it's just something that happens. So I don't know if you can necessarily skip over it and be like, yeah, we can institute capitalism just to burn it down. I don't know. Again, against the government, so therefore the communists must continually support the radical liberal party, taking care to avoid the self-deprecations of the bourgeois and not fall for the enticing promises of benefits which a victory for the bourgeois would allegedly bring to the proletariat. The sole advantages which the proletariat would derive from a bourgeois victory would consist, one, in various concessions, which would facilitate the unification of the proletariat into a closely knit, battle-worthy, and organized class, which is kind of like, I guess, reforming the party to be like a battle-worthy communist party. I don't know if that could ever happen. But the more you want to say, oh, we want affordable housing and this and healthcare and education, and the more you get jerked off by the bourgeois parties and it doesn't happen, the more people might go to the extremes, right? And you see that with Donald Trump and stuff. Two, in the certainty that on the very day the absolute monarchies fall, the struggle between bourgeois and proletariat will start. From that day on, the policy of the communists will be the same as it is now, is in the countries where the bourgeois is already in power. In the name and on the mandate of the Congress. A lot about private property. Here's the footnotes and stuff. Have a good time with that. Had a good long chat about communism. Who expected that?